My first guest is Mervyn Tilley, Chairman of Focus on Israel. Now, Purim is coming upon us, but it was a time of suffering for the Jews. What is Purim?
Purim is a Jewish celebration that goes back to the time of Queen Esther, Mordecai, recorded in the book of Esther, how the Jews were spared extermination as a result of a plot of Haman.
And what sort of message is there for people today in the story of Purim?
Well, basically it's a reminder that God keeps covenant with his people, and despite all the odds being stacked against them, whenever God is involved, there's always a way out.
Do you think it's important today for Christians to celebrate Purim as well?
I wouldn't see it necessarily as important for Christians to celebrate Purim because it's a Jewish festival, although Christians can learn from the covenant-keeping side of God that he keeps covenant with the church as well.
Now, through many of the Jewish holidays, we can clearly see Jesus through them. How can we see Jesus in the story of Purim?
That's a good question. I'm not too sure that one can draw too many parallels other than that Jesus is the supreme deliverer of his people. I wouldn't read too much more into it, at least not from my perspective.
Now, all through the history of the Jews, there's been anti-Semitism, there's been expulsions, Holocaust, and desecration of synagogues. Why do you think that is?
I think that anything that God is for, the devil is against. And from day one, the nation of Israel has been the subject of hatred and persecution from day one of their existence, and so history keeps on repeating itself.
Now, today seems to be no exception. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is threatening to wipe Israel off the map. Do you think this threat is real, and is he wanting nuclear weapons, and do you think he could actually wipe off Israel from the map?
Well, I am sure the threat is very, very real. I am sure that Iran is intent on having nuclear weapons, and yes, they would consider Israel a target. However, I do not believe that they would wipe out Israel or even could wipe out Israel, because God has brought them beyond the point of no return, in the sense that they have recovered from the Holocaust, they are established as a nation, and I don't see the clock being turned back. There may well be an attempt to exterminate them, because Zechariah talks about all nations coming against Jerusalem, but they will most certainly fail.
So you'd sort of in some way see this as prophetic, that the Jews have to survive?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's clear in Scripture that the Jews have to survive, although, having said that, God says in Ezekiel 36 that God is not sparing Israel for Israel's sake, but for his name's sake, for the sake of his reputation, because if Israel were to fail or fall, then God's name would be blemished considerably, because he's invested so much in Israel.
Now, what do you think is the root cause of anti-Semitism? Is anti-Semitism actually a spiritual battle?
It's flesh and blood, but it's underlying it, there is a spiritual reason. I do believe that the main reason for anti-Semitism is jealousy on the part of the nations, because God has favored the Jews, and even in the most adverse circumstances they have survived. Not only survived, they have succeeded in building business, etc., etc. They are supreme survivors, and so that would be my answer.
Now, many people claim today that disasters have hit other nations because they've touched Israel. Do you think that's coincidence, or is this God's discipline on those nations?
Well, if you take Genesis 12:3, I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you, it could well be argued that nations that interfere with Israel in a negative sense do pay a price, and I do believe there's a fair amount of evidence to support that. And so yes, I do believe there is a negative to nations who malign Israel, attack Israel, and basically persecute Israel.
Now, in the story of Esther, Mordecai says Esther should intercede for her people, and maybe she was born for such a time as this. Do you think God raised up leaders to protect the nation of Israel?
Undoubtedly. There have been people highlighted throughout Scripture, people who have stood up and been counted, people who have been raised up as judges, deliverers, prophets. All through Israel's history there has been a man or a woman for that matter, for the occasion. And so Esther and Mordecai would most definitely come into that category.
Now, the Holocaust was a tragedy that was really allowed to happen. Do you think it could actually ever happen again in Europe? After all, the far-right movement seemed to be growing quite strong in popularity.
Theoretically, yes, it could happen, but in actual fact, I don't believe it would happen, simply because we've moved on from the Holocaust. But it doesn't mean to say that there will not be an attempt to exterminate Israel within its own borders. That's a different matter altogether. But as far as Europe is concerned, even though the Muslim influence is increasing dramatically, I do not see a return to the Holocaust days.
Now, denying the Holocaust is illegal, but there are still many people who deny the Holocaust. Why do you think people deny the Holocaust today?
That's a very good question. I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. It's bizarre. It's ridiculous to deny something which is historically established. Maybe they've got something against the Jews, and therefore they want to remove them from people's minds. I don't know, but certainly Ahmadinejad, Iran, also is a Holocaust denier, and he's living in denial himself, really.
Now, what's your prayers for the Jewish people who've suffered so much over the centuries?
Well, obviously my main prayer would be for the Jews to recognize their Messiah. They have suffered incredibly over the centuries, but God has restored them to the land. He has brought them back. He's re-established them. They are, I think, the fifth most successful country in the world economically, but spiritually they're still far away. However, God is working. Many individual Jews are coming to faith, but national Israel is a little way off from that. But I do believe it'll happen, and that is my prayer.
So let's look at the other side of the story, the struggles and difficulties Palestinians face.
I'm in the office of Victor Batasha, who's the Mayor of Bethlehem, situated just outside the Church of the Nativity, where Jesus was born. Victor, what's it like being the Mayor of Bethlehem?
Well, being the Mayor of Bethlehem is a big challenge for me. It is a great honor for me to be the mayor of this holy city, the birthplace of Jesus Christ, the cradle of Christianity, and to maintain this city in the best possible ways for all pilgrims and tourists to be welcomed with love and peace in this city.
What's your biggest challenge as mayor at the moment?
Well, my biggest challenge actually now is the bad economic situation of the city of Bethlehem due to the wall of separation that has been built by the Israeli authorities around this holy city. This holy city has become a big prison for its citizens, and people cannot go out to work, employees cannot leave to work, teachers, students, even patients in ambulances cannot leave the city except with a special permit, which is rarely granted. Secondly, this will affect the income of pilgrims and tourists, and that's why we are in a very bad economic situation. We cannot pay the salaries of our employees, and here we do look for help from our Christian brothers all over the world to help the city of Bethlehem, especially during these times where there is a boycott by the whole world for the whole Palestinian population. I think the city of Bethlehem, this holy city, should not be abandoned by all Christians all over the world. This is their own city. Every citizen all over the world should consider this city as his own city, and they should not abandon this holy city.
What's the unemployment rate here in Bethlehem?
The unemployment rate in Bethlehem is about 50% actually, due to the closure and due to the closures every now and then, and due to this wall of separation. And we are, as I told you, in a very bad economic situation.
Yes.
And I think the future looks to be very gloomy.
So how many tourists do you get here every year?
Nowadays, last month, for example, I got a report that we had about 45,000 tourists for the month of April. It depends. Sometimes it's 30,000 per month, sometimes 40,000. But this actually represents only about 15 to 20% of the usual tourism and pilgrimage to this city in the year 2000. For example, we had about 1.5 million in that year, pilgrims and tourists. Now, the other main thing is, most of these tourists and pilgrims do not sleep in the city of Bethlehem, so we do not benefit from them.
Right.
What we need is pilgrimage and tourists to come and sleep over at least 2 nights in Bethlehem, so that the city will benefit from them economically.
Yeah. So how can Christians pray for you and the city where Jesus was born?
Well, I think Christians all over the world should pray for the city of Bethlehem, should pray for the citizens of Bethlehem, should pray for the churches in Bethlehem, should pray for the municipality in Bethlehem, and to pray and do something for the city. Praying will help a lot, but doing something on the ground will help too.
Lovely, Mayor. Thank you very much.
Don't mention it. Thank you.